Hi Barbie! In today's video, I'm very excited to share with you my new PDF pattern, which is called Perfect Doll Pattern and can be found in my Etsy shop as a downloadable PDF. Now I've used this pattern to create 3 different Barbie-inspired dresses for Halloween, but also because I love the new Barbie movie so much. So without further ado, let's just get straight into the process because I'm very excited to share with you. So let's get into it. For the first dress in this video, I'm going to be making this hot pink dress that I will later transform and paint to be like Weird Barbie. In the pattern instructions, I call this dress the Weird Doll Dress. And my dress is made from a cotton blended fabric that I dyed a signature Barbie pink. It has a high neckline that is finished with bias binding, and the bodice is shaped with darts at the front, back, and sides. The skirt is made with 3 skirt pieces that are gathered down at the waist, and this dress has large puffy sleeves that are finished with a sleeve band. The second dress or ensemble in this video is inspired by Depression Barbie, and in the instructions I call it the Sad Doll Dress. The dress has a high neckline that is finished with a ruffle, and the dress is sleeveless with the armholes finished with bias binding. In addition to the dress pattern pieces, I've also included pattern pieces to create a simple boxy jacket, which is also finished with bias binding. The last dress in this video is inspired by Barbie's pink gingham dress. I call it the Gingham doll dress. This dress has a lower scooped neckline, and for my dress in this video, I cut 5 skirt pieces so that I could create pleats and have a fuller skirt. I think this dress shows a few small tweaks can really change the dress to better suit your taste. And that was sort of my hope for this pattern, that it could be used as a starting point or base for many projects. So those are the 3 Barbie-inspired dresses I will be covering in this video. And this pattern is available in my Etsy shop as a downloadable PDF. After you download the PDF, select the PDF you wish to print, and print the PDF pattern on the correct paper size, A4 or US letter. Be sure your scale is set to 100%, and if needed, check your print margins and set them to 0. After you have printed the PDF out, you will want to use a ruler and check the measurements of the square on the first page. If everything looks good, you can continue assembling the PDF pages into a grid to form the full pattern. To assemble, I simply trim the margins of the pages as needed and overlap them and tape the pages together. The PDF I am using is 42 pages, and these pages will create a grid that is 7 pages across and 6 pages tall, for a total of 42 pages. Sizes 30 through 38 have a 42-page PDF for a grid that is 7 pages across and 6 pages tall, and sizes 40 through 48 have a 56-page PDF for a grid that is 8 pages across and 7 pages tall. So the grid you are creating might be 42 pages or 56, it's just depending on the pattern size you want. And speaking of sizing, the sizes for this pattern are labeled by the bust size in inches. So for example, I have a 38-inch bust, so I will be using the pattern size labeled 38. And as I'm taping the pages of the PDF together, I'm working carefully to make sure everything is lining up correctly. And here's how the pattern looks once all of the pages have been put together in a grid. After assembling the PDF, I cut the pattern pieces to my selected size, which is size 38. And again, the pattern sizing is marked by the bust size in inches. So when I measure around the fullest part of my bust, it is about 38 inches. So I'm going to choose size 38 and then cut the pattern pieces to that selected size. Next, I create a mock-up from some leftover brown fabric, just so I can try on the bodice and make sure it is all fitting exactly how I want. I highly recommend you make a mock-up before cutting into your nice dress fabric. This can save you so much heartache. This is also a great chance to fine-tune the fit of your garment. Everyone has a unique body, so sometimes tweaks and changes are necessary for the best fit. After I make my mock-up, I tried it on and tested the fit of both the higher neckline and the lower scoop neckline. I was pretty satisfied with the fit, so I moved right along and started getting my materials ready. For my weird doll dress, I'm using about 3 meters of white cotton blended fabric. This fabric has a slightly heavier weight to it, but the white color and cotton fiber means it will be easy to dye. For dye, I'm using Dylon and Flamingo Pink. I will also be using pink thread, a 60 centimeter pink zipper, and bias tape that I'm going to dye a matching pink color. Now, while I only had double fold bias tape on hand, I think single fold bias tape works fine too. Besides, after I dyed it, I had to re-iron it anyways. Of course, you could opt to purchase fabric in the correct colorway, and then you could skip the fuss of dyeing and ironing. And once my pink dress is complete, I will next paint it with acrylic paint to make it look more like Weird Barbie's dress. Now, my dress is just a fun Halloween dress, but you may wish to heat set your acrylic paint or opt for fabric paint, or you could just forego the paint altogether. For my sad doll dress, I used about 3 meters of this white and blue striped cotton blend fabric. It was mostly cotton, so it was able to be dyed, and it was sort of a mid to lightweight fabric. I couldn't find a fabric that closely resembled Barbie's pastel check print, so I made do using this fabric and I dyed it pink so it'll be pink and blue striped. I think it gave a sort of similar vibe. To dye this fabric, I will also be using the same Dylon dye in Flamingo Pink, and additionally I will be using pink thread, a 60 centimeter zipper, and bias tape to finish the armholes. And for my gingham doll dress, I'm going to use 350 centimeters of this pink and white gingham fabric in cotton. Now I did double the bodice layer because this fabric was pretty lightweight, and I did cut 5 skirt pieces instead of 3. So it was a very tight fit getting it all cut out. And if you decide to cut out additional skirt pieces, I recommend purchasing extra fabric. Additionally, I used pink thread, a 40 centimeter zipper, and white double fold bias tape that was about a 1/4 inch wide to finish the neckline and armholes. And the next step for me was to dye my fabric and prep it so it was ready to be cut out. First, I did a little dye test on a small piece of fabric, and then I dried everything and looked at the color, and I was pretty satisfied with it, so I moved right along to dyeing my actual lengths of fabric for the project. Now, dyeing my fabric was a little more art than science. I simply got my fabric completely wet, and then in my sink I added the dye and boiling hot water, and then I mixed the two together thoroughly. And then I submerged my fabric and stirred it, making sure to agitate the fabric in the dye water so that it would dye evenly. Once I was happy with the color, I carefully removed the fabric from the sink, squeezed the remaining water out of it, and then transferred it to the plastic bin. That way I could take it to my washing machine for a wash. After washing it, I dried it and then ironed it. Now, if you decide to dye your fabric, I recommend carefully reading the instructions on the dye packet and checking to make sure your fabric has a fiber content that can be dyed. Again, my fabric is mostly cotton, so it was able to take the dye. Overall, I was pretty happy with how my fabric came out. There was a little noticeable streaking for my white turned pink fabric, but nothing that didn't work well for Weird Barbie. I really wanted to focus on stash busting for this project, and dyeing the fabric I already had on hand was a great solution. And with that, my fabric was ready to be cut into, so I could lay out all of my pattern pieces and start cutting. And the first project I'm going to cut out is the bright pink fabric for Weird Barbie. When cutting out my pattern pieces for Weird Barbie, I also managed to squeeze in some pieces for Depression Barbie's jacket. I wanted to back the jacket front and back pieces with this heavier weight fabric so that it would have a little more heft and structure to it. And I thought the backing would give the jacket a nice shape. So you can see here is the jacket front and the jacket back, which I'm going to set aside and use later for Depression Barbie's jacket. But for my Weird Barbie dress, I have cut out 2 bodice back pieces with the high neckline, 1 bodice front piece cut on the fold with the high neckline. I've also cut 2 sleeve bands, 2 sleeves, and 3 skirt pieces. And all 3 skirt pieces have been cut on the fold. So that's 10 pieces for Weird Barbie's bright pink dress. Next, I'm going to cut out all the pieces for Depression Barbie's dress and jacket. It took a little squeezing to get all of the dress and jacket pieces, but I managed. And for Depression Barbie's dress, I have cut out 3 skirt pieces on the fold, 2 bodice back pieces with the high neckline, 1 bodice front with the high neckline cut on the fold, and 1 ruffle piece which is cut on the fold. This is for the high neckline. And for the jacket, I have cut out 2 jacket sleeves, 2 jacket fronts, and 1 jacket back, which is cut on the fold. Additionally, I have cut out 2 jacket front pieces and 1 jacket back piece from the heavier weight pink fabric, which I'm going to use as backing. And that is everything for Depression Barbie. The next dress to cut out is the gingham dress for Barbie, and it is only 3 pattern pieces. But please note, I have opted for 5 skirt pieces instead of the 3. However, it's totally up to you if you wish to cut 3 or 5 skirt pieces. You can cut 3 skirt pieces for a skirt much more similar to the one I show for Weird Barbie, and you can just gather down the waistline. Or you could cut 5 skirt pieces and gather it down for a much fuller skirt. I am going to cut 5 pieces and then by hand create pleats that mimic the dress and pleats from the movie. This, of course, will take more time, and making pleats can be very challenging, but it is a possibility and an option if you want to give it a go. I also recommend cutting an odd number of skirt pieces. That way you don't end up with a seam in the front of your dress. In addition to cutting 5 skirt pieces instead of 3, I also cut a second layer for my bodice pieces. This was because my gingham fabric was so lightweight and I wanted the bodice to have a little more heft to it. Now I barely managed to squeeze this all out of my 350 centimeters of fabric. So I recommend you purchase much more fabric. But for my gingham Barbie dress, I have 5 skirt pieces cut on the fold, 4 bodice back pieces with the scoop neckline, and 2 bodice front pieces with the scoop neckline cut on the fold. And with that, everything is cut out and ready for my 3 Barbie dresses, and I am ready to get sewing. The first dress I am going to make is my hot pink dress for Weird Barbie. And the first thing I'm going to do is cut the darts out of my pattern piece and then use this pattern piece like a stencil to draw the darts in on my bodice. I am drawing the darts on the wrong side of my fabric, and I am being a little bit naughty by using a pen to draw the darts. I recommend you use chalk or disappearing ink. I also draw in the darts for my bodice back pieces. And here's what the darts look like on my bodice front. Next, I match the legs of the darts to one another and pin the dart in place. I'm sort of folding the dart in half along its center, matching the sides of the dart together and pinning it in place. I repeat this for all of the darts. And here's how the darts look once they have been pinned in place on my bodice front. And now I'm on a bit of a roll with the darts, so I continue on matching the legs of the dart together and pinning the dart for all of my bodice back pieces. And here you can see how all of the darts look. Next, I'm going to stitch the darts in place. I like to start at the bottom of the dart and sew upwards, slowly tapering my stitching off the fabric. As I stitch the dart in place, I want to take care and make sure that the dart looks good and isn't twisted or warped in some way. Work slowly, work carefully, and make sure the dart legs are nice and lined up. And this is how my dart looks once it has been stitched in place. And I'm going to continue this and repeat this on all of the darts for both the bodice front and bodice back. After stitching all of my darts into my bodice pieces, I'm going to match the bodice front to the bodice back at the shoulder edges. And I want the right sides to be facing one another. So I will make sure that the right sides are facing together, and then I will pin the shoulders of my bodice front to my bodice back and then stitch. And I will be sewing with 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance or 5/8 inch. After sewing my shoulder edges of the bodice together, I will use pinking shears to trim the seam allowance. Now you may wish to finish your seams with a different method. You could choose to trim the edges and use a zigzag stitch, or an overlock machine, or maybe you prefer to create French seams. This is totally up to you, how you wish to finish the seams, but please be mindful of seam allowance when deciding on your finishing method. For me, I felt the pinking shears made a tidy enough finish. Next, I'm going to put together the sleeves so that I can add them to the armhole of my bodice. The first thing I'm going to do is add a line of gathering stitches to my sleeve head and to the bottom edge of my sleeve. I will set my machine to the straight stitch on the longest length, and then I will stitch around the sleeve head edge as well as the bottom edge. These long link stitches will be used to gather down the sleeve so that it can fit into the armhole and be the same length as the sleeve band. Next, I'm going to gently pull on the thread of my gathering line of stitches along the bottom edge of my sleeve. I'm going to gather down the bottom edge of my sleeve so it is the same length as my sleeve band. I like to focus my gathers to the center of the sleeve, but you may want to evenly spread them out. After that, I'm going to match the sleeve band to the bottom edge of my sleeve and pin them together. I want the right side of my sleeve band to be facing the wrong side of my sleeve. After pinning, I will then stitch the sleeve band to my sleeve, sewing along that bottom edge. And as I sew, I want to be sure that I'm sewing just a bit above my gathering line of stitches so that it will be hidden. I also want to sew very slowly just to make sure all of my gathers are sitting in place correctly. Next, I'm going to create a finished bottom edge to my sleeve by folding up that sleeve band. First off, when I look at the right side of my sleeve, I want to see the sleeve band. Then I can fold the raw bottom edge of that sleeve band upwards, and I will fold it again so that the folded bottom edge is just covering my previous line of stitching. So to reiterate, you will be folding that bottom edge of the sleeve band up 2 times. The first fold is to hide its raw edge, and the second fold is to create the finished bottom edge of the sleeve. You will want to place that folded edge just so it covers the stitching at the bottom edge of the sleeve, and then pin it in place. And you will do this all along the bottom edge of the sleeve, folding the sleeve band up twice and then pinning it over top the stitching. This is what's going to create that finished bottom edge of your sleeve and look like a cuff. You can also take a moment and iron it if you like, and when folding, just take care that you're not twisting or warping that sleeve band. You want it to be pinned in place pretty smooth and tidy. Now I'm going to stitch that sleeve band down in place, and I will sew very closely to the folded edge of the sleeve band. I also gave a second line of top stitching to the bottom edge of my sleeve band because I liked the look of it. And as an alternative to the sleeve band, you could consider finishing the bottom edge of your sleeve with elastic. And now that the bottom edge of my sleeve is finished, I can insert the sleeve into the armhole of my bodice. I will be fitting the large curved top edge of my sleeve into the armhole of my bodice. And to make it fit, I will be gathering down that top curved edge by pulling the threads of my gathering stitches. So to start, I like to match the side of my sleeve to the side of my bodice and pin with right sides together. I work carefully matching the curved sleeve edge to the curved armhole edge and pin them together, working along the armhole from the armpit up towards the top of the shoulder. And I repeat this on the other side. Once I reach that top shoulder section of the sleeve, I begin pulling the thread of my gathering stitches, and I gather down that sleeve head so that it fits into the armhole of my bodice. And I carefully massage the gathers on the sleeve head so that they are even and well spaced. I also like to focus my gathers to the top shoulder portion of the sleeve, and I even use a ruler to make sure that they are symmetrical and even. I keep gathering down the sleeve head until it is the same length and fits into the armhole, and then I pin it all in place. Next, I take it to the sewing machine and I stitch it in place, taking care as I sew over top the gathers. Then I trim the seam allowance with my pinking shears. And I repeat this for my other sleeve so that both my sleeves have been set into the armholes of my bodice. Again, I take care with the gathers and I use the ruler to check them and make sure that they are even and the sleeves are symmetrical. Now that both sleeves are set into the armhole, I'm going to match the sides of my bodice and sleeve together, pin and stitch. I will match the bodice front to the bodice back together at the sides, and I'm also going to be matching the sides of my sleeve together. I will be matching them with right sides touching, and I want to make sure that all of my seams and edges are lined up, especially the cuff's bottom edge and the armpit seam of my bodice. After pinning and stitching, I will trim the seam allowance with my pinking shears, and I'm going to repeat it for the other side of my bodice. And everything is looking good so far. Here is how my bodice looks. The next thing will be adding the skirt to the bodice. First, I'm going to sew the sides of my skirt pieces together with right sides touching. I will match my 3 skirt pieces together along their side edges and pin and then stitch. Next, I will trim the excess seam allowance with my pinking shears. And then I'm going to have one big skirt piece. After the side edges of my skirt pieces have been sewn together, I am now going to add a gathering line of stitches to the top edge of my skirt, or the waist edge. I'm going to set my machine to the straight stitch on the longest length, and then I'm going to sew along that top edge or waist edge with a long length straight stitch, which is going to be the gathering line of stitches. This is so I can gather down the top edge of my skirt so that it can fit the bottom edge of my bodice. This is what's going to join the bottom edge of my bodice to the top edge of my skirt and create sort of that waist seam. So again, I set my machine to a straight stitch on the longest length, and then I sew along the top edge of my long skirt piece. Next, I can match the center front of my bodice to the center front of my skirt with right sides together and pin. I'm going to match and pin those center front points together. Now I can begin gathering down the top edge of my skirt by gently pulling on the thread of my gathering stitches and moving and massaging the gathers into place. I'm going to do this for both sides, trying to keep the gathers even and symmetrical. And once again, the top edge of my skirt is going to end up being the same length as the bottom edge of my bodice, which is going to be where I create that waist seam. And once I've gathered everything down, everything is even and symmetrical, I'm going to pin the two together. And now that my skirt has been pinned to my bodice, it is ready to be stitched in place. And as I stitch my skirt to my bodice along those waist edges, I am going to take care sewing over top my gathers. And after sewing, I trim the seam allowance with my pinking shears. And then I decided I wanted to add a little top stitching to the waist of my dress, so I pressed the seam allowance of the skirt up towards the bodice and then carefully top stitch it down in place. I thought this gave it a nice finished look, but the top stitching is totally optional. Next, I'm going to add the zipper to the back of my dress. First, I match and then pin the back edges of my dress together. I match the back edge with right sides touching and pin from the neckline down to the bottom edge of the skirt. I also make a note of where I want my zipper to end. You can indicate this with pins or chalk. I just added a double pin. Next, I'm going to sew these back edges together. I will start at the neckline and sew down to the bottom edge of my skirt. However, I will sew with a basting stitch or a long length stitch from the neckline to where I want my zipper to end. And then I'm going to change to a regular length stitch, and from the zipper's ending point, I'm going to continue sewing down to the bottom edge of my dress. After sewing the back edges together, I will press the back seam open, and in this back seam, I'm going to nestle my zipper and pin it in place. I want the teeth of my zipper to be facing the back seam. And after I have pinned my zipper in place, I am going to quickly hand baste the zipper in place. Basting the zipper is totally optional, but I prefer this because it prevents being poked by pins when you go to sew the zipper in by machine. It's also a great way to make sure that the zipper is securely in place before machine stitching. After I have finished basting by hand my zipper into the back seam of my dress, I'm going to use my seam ripper to remove those center back stitches that I made earlier with the machine. This is going to reveal the zipper so that you can open it. I find that this will make it easier to machine stitch your zipper in place. I just changed my zipper foot and then stitched down either side of the zipper. Afterwards, you can use your seam ripper to pick out any remaining basting stitches. And with the zipper added, all that's left to do is tidy up the raw edges of the neckline and the skirt. There are several different ways you could finish the neckline. For example, you could add a lining or facing. but I'm going to use bias tape to finish my neckline. I'm going to fold the edge of the bias tape inwards and then match it all around the neckline of my bodice. I want the right side of my bias tape to be facing the right side of my bodice, and I will work around the entire neckline, pinning the bias tape in place, and then I will stitch it in place, taking care to stitch in the folded edge of my bias tape. Once I reach the other side of my neckline, I will cut the bias tape, and I will fold its raw edge inwards to hide it and then stitch it down in place. Next, I'm going to very carefully clip into the seam allowance of my neckline, taking care not to cut through my stitching. I also opted to only clip the neckline of my bodice, and I did not clip the bias tape. Clipping this allowance should make turning easier. Next, I carefully folded the bias tape towards the inside of my dress, pressed it, and then pinned it in place. The bias tape should very carefully ease around the curved neckline without any puckering, and then I stitched the bias tape in place, stitching on top of the folded edge to secure it. And this is how your neckline should look once finished. The bias tape method is a great way, and it's fairly easy. It's a good way to finish the neckline of your garment, but again, there are other options like lining or a facing. And now the only thing left to do is finish the bottom edge of your dress. I chose to finish my bottom edge with a simple rolled hem. I folded the bottom edge inwards 2 times, just a tiny amount, and then I stitched it in place. Afterwards, I gave the hem a press with an iron. Of course, you could choose a different hem method or some other different option. It's totally up to you. But I just used the simple rolled hem. And with that, my bright pink dress was complete, and I think it is so cute, and I loved how bright and Barbie pink it turned out. And so I just decided to enjoy it a few days just as a pink dress before returning to it and then painting it all wacky for Weird Barbie. Now for the painting, I didn't do anything all that special. I was initially dreading the painting. I was so afraid I'd mess it up. But once I started, my anxiety dissipated and the painting turned out to be my favorite part. I just used some acrylic paint I already had on hand, and I tried my best to look at and copy a photo of Weird Barbie. But I sort of ended up winging it. I used a large paintbrush so I could just roughly slap on the acrylic paint and sort of build up the color and add splotches of vibrant paint. As I went, I tried my best not to mix the color too much. Again, I wanted to keep everything very bold and vibrant. And after I let the paint dry for a moment, I returned and gave it a few squiggles with a permanent marker. As I mentioned before, you might prefer fabric paint for something a little more long-lasting, or you might try heat setting your paint. Or, of course, you could just forego the painting altogether. This is totally up to you. But the rough acrylic paint was just a fun way to transform the bright pink Barbie dress into something very funky and crazy for Weird Barbie. And all in all, I think it came together pretty nicely. I mean, it is very Weird Barbie, and I am very satisfied with the finished look. So yeah, here it is. Here is my finished Weird doll dress, and I'm just really happy with it. So now we can move on and start making the Depression Barbie ensemble, which is going to be the dress and jacket. I'm going to start by drawing the darts on the wrong side of my bodice front and bodice back pieces. Here you can see me using the pattern piece kind of like a stencil and drawing in my darts. I'm also being a little bit naughty using a pen, but I recommend you use chalk or disappearing ink to draw your darts in. After I finish drawing the darts onto the wrong side of my bodice pieces, I then fold the dart in half and match the dart legs together and pin the dart in place. I like to pin all 8 of my bodice darts first, and then I go to the machine and stitch all of the darts in place. Here you can see a dart with the sides of the dart matched together and pinned. When sewing the darts, I like to start at the bottom of the dart and work my way upwards, tapering the dart off the bodice. After stitching the dart, you can tie the thread ends together and iron it. Using a dressmaker's ham is very helpful. And I just go ahead and complete the sewing on all of the darts for both my bodice front and bodice back pieces. Once all of your darts have been sewn, you can match the bodice front to the bodice back at the shoulder edges, and make sure the right sides of the fabric are facing one another. So again, I matched the bodice front to the bodice back at the shoulders and pinned them together. After pinning, I sew using 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance, or 5/8 inch. Next, I trim the seam allowance with pinking shears. Next, I decided I wanted to finish my armholes with bias tape. I had a little bright pink bias tape left over from Weird Barbie, so I decided to use it for the armholes to create a tidy, finished edge. I laid my bias tape on top of my bodice so that the right side of my bias tape was facing the right side of my fabric. And then I opened up one of the bias tape edges and stitched down in that little fold, attaching the bias tape to the armhole of my bodice. Now I decided to fold my bias tape all the way to the inside of my bodice and top stitch it down. However, you could fold it halfway so that it covers the raw edge and creates sort of a binded, finished look. And it does give it a little pop of color. But I just clipped the seam allowance of just my fabric. I did not clip into the bias tape, and then I folded my bias tape to the inside of my bodice and top stitched it down. I then pressed the armhole and bias tape with an iron. And as I was sewing the bias tape, I took care to make sure I wasn't creating any puckering on the armhole. And here you can see the bias tape finishing on the armholes of my bodice. For a super tidy finish, you could sew the sides of the bodice first and then add the bias tape. There is a little flexibility in how you wish to finish the armholes, but I find this way very easy. I'm also going to wait on sewing up the sides of my bodice for just a moment. I first want to add the ruffle to the high neckline. I find it easier to add the ruffle before I sew up the sides. Now I'm going to add the ruffle to my bodice's neckline. First, I'm going to take my ruffle, which is a long rectangle shape, and fold it in half long ways. And I want the wrong sides of my fabric facing one another. That way, the right side of the fabric is visible. Next, I'm going to pin the ruffle's long edges together and then stitch it. I'm also going to hide those short edges on the ruffle by tucking them inwards and top stitching them down. After stitching, I'm going to change my stitch settings to the long length and add a gathering line of stitches all along the bottom edge. I also trimmed the bottom edge with pinking shears and then gave the ruffle a quick press with my iron. So now my ruffle is a long strip of fabric. The folded edge is the top edge of the ruffle. The side edges are turned in and top stitched down, and the bottom edge has been sewn and has been given a gathering line of stitches. It is now ready to be gathered down to the same length as my neckline and then pinned in place. I'm going to match the right side of my bodice to my ruffle and match the neckline edge to the bottom edge of my ruffle and pin these two edges together. This may take a little adjusting as you space the gathers out and get it evenly across the neckline. But by gently pulling the thread on the gathering line of stitches and massaging the gathers in place, you can position the gathers evenly around the neckline and then pin the ruffle to the neckline. After pinning the ruffle to the neckline in place, you can carefully stitch the ruffle to the neckline. And if you like, you can trim the seam allowance. The next thing to do is tidy up the inside of your ruffle and neckline with a bit of bias tape. I'm going to open one side of my bias tape up and stitch it down to the ruffle. I will stitch in the folded crease of the bias tape, stitching the bias tape to the entire neckline. I will also make sure that the side edges of the bias tape have been folded inwards, just so that little tail of bias tape doesn't have a raw edge. Then I'm going to press the bias tape downwards towards the bodice while simultaneously pressing the ruffle up. The bias tape should cover the entire neckline seam. Now I'm going to stitch the other side of the bias tape down. This time I am stitching the bias tape to the bodice. And as I stitch, I want to carefully work around the entire neckline, making sure my bias tape isn't causing any puckering. And here you can see the neckline with the ruffle and with the bias tape added. The bias tape is going to create a nice finished edge while also acting like a bit of a collar stand, sort of gently supporting the ruffle upwards. After I've attached the ruffle, I'm going to match the sides of my bodice together, matching the bodice front to the bodice back at the side edges and pinning together with right sides touching. Then I will stitch the side edges, trim with pinking shears, and as an extra precaution add a zigzag stitch. Now again, I want to quickly mention that you could wait until after you have sewn the side seams of your bodice to finish up the armholes with bias tape. This may give it a tidier finish with the side seam, but it's totally up to you. And now that the bodice is finished, let's put together the skirt so we can attach it to the bodice. First, I'm going to sew the sides of my skirt pieces together. With right sides facing one another, I'm going to match my skirt pieces together along their side edges and pin. I will do this 2 times so that I can join my 3 skirt pieces together to create one long skirt piece. After pinning, I will stitch the sides together and then trim with pinking shears and finish with a zigzag stitch. And then all along the top edge of my skirt, I'm going to add a long length stitch, a gathering stitch. That way I can gather down the waist edge of my skirt so that it fits the bodice's waist edge. And just along that top edge of my skirt, I'm going to stitch that long length gathering line of stitches. And now I can start matching the skirt to my bodice. The first thing I'm going to do is match the center front point of my skirt to the center front point of my bodice and pin these 2 pieces together with right sides touching. I've matched the center front points together and have them pinned. I am next going to gently pull the thread of my gathering stitches, and I'm going to gather down the top waist edge of my skirt so that it fits the waist edge of my bodice. I'm going to work carefully, gathering down the skirt and making sure the gathers are evenly spaced, and I'm going to do this for both sides of my skirt. As I pull these threads, I'm going to try to be very gentle and just massage the gathers in place. Again, just taking care to make sure everything's even, well spaced, and symmetrical. Once my skirt's top edge has been gathered down so that it's the same length as my bodice's waist edge, I will pin these two together, again making sure that right sides are touching. After pinning, I will stitch the skirt to my bodice along that waist edge, and I'm going to take care as I sew over top my gathers. I've also decided that I wanted to press the seam allowance upwards towards the bodice, and then I top stitched it down in place. I just thought this was a nice detail to add. And now that the skirt has been attached to the bodice, I'm going to add the zipper. First, I'm going to match the center back edges of my dress together with right sides touching. I will take care to match the collar and waist seam as I pin the center back edges together. I'm also going to indicate where I want my zipper to end. I used an additional pin to indicate this, but you could use chalk or disappearing ink. Now what I'm going to do is stitch the center back edges of my dress together. And I'm going to start at the neckline and I'm going to stitch down to where I want my zipper to end and stitch with a basting stitch. Then I'm going to change to a regular length stitch and sew from where I want my zipper to end all the way down to the bottom edge of my dress. And then I'm going to press the center back seam open. It is in the center back seam I'm going to add my zipper. I'm going to nestle the zipper right into the seam with the teeth facing the dress, and I'm going to pin it in place. After pinning my zipper, I like to baste it by hand. I like to baste it by hand first to prevent being poked by pins when machine stitching the zipper. And basting will keep that zipper in place when you're working on it. But basting is optional. After basting the zipper in the back of my dress, I'm going to take my seam ripper and open up that back seam in my dress. This will reveal the zipper. I find that it makes it easier to sew the zipper this way. Next, I change to the zipper foot on my machine and then I sew the zipper into the back of my dress, going down either side. Then, using the seam ripper, I remove any remaining basting stitches in the back of my dress. Now all that's left to do is finish up the bottom edge of my dress. I have chosen to add a simple rolled hem. I simply folded up the bottom edge 2 times and then stitched it down, and then I pressed that bottom edge with an iron. However, you could choose a different hem method for your dress. This is totally up to you. And for one last final touch, I decided I wanted to add a little ribbon bow to the front of my dress. So I tied a little bow with some ribbon that I had on hand, and then I hand tacked it to the center of my collar. And while the dress is looking good, it is in desperate need of the matching boxy jacket. So let's work on the jacket next. First off, my jacket front and jacket back pieces are very thin and lightweight. So I'm going to be backing my striped fabric with some hot pink fabric. This will give the jacket a little more weight and structure. I'm going to pin the same pieces together with the wrong sides touching. So I match my jacket back piece in stripes to my jacket back piece in pink with the wrong sides touching. I pin and then baste all of the edges together, making sure that the pieces are flat and smooth against one another. Once all of the edges have been basted together, I trim the edges just a tiny bit to make them all even and tidy, and now I can treat this as one piece. I do this for my jacket back piece and both of my jacket fronts. Next, I match my 2 jacket front pieces to my jacket back piece at the shoulder edges. I match the shoulders together with right sides touching, the striped sides facing one another. After pinning, I stitch the shoulder edges together, and then I finish the seam by trimming it with pinking shears, and then I go back and add a zigzag stitch for extra security, and then I press the seam towards the back of the jacket and top stitch it down. Maybe I went a little overboard, but I wanted the shoulder seam to be very tidy and secure and ready for the sleeves. Now before I add the sleeves to my jacket, I am first going to finish the bottom edge of my sleeve. You can add a tiny rolled hem, but I'm going to finish the bottom of my sleeve with bias tape. First, I stitch the bias tape in the folded crease to the right side of my sleeve. Then I fold the bias tape towards the wrong side of my sleeve and press it with an iron. Next, I stitch the bias tape down on the inside of my sleeve to secure it. And this is what the bottom edge of my sleeves look like with the bias tape finishing. Next, you can add a gathering line of stitches into the sleeve head. This will make easing the sleeve head into the armhole of the jacket easier. To insert my sleeves into the armhole of my jacket, I'm going to match that curved top edge of my sleeve into the curved armhole of my jacket, working from either side upwards towards the shoulder, and then gently easing in the top shoulder of my sleeve into the armhole so that it fits. I pin the jacket in place as I go, with the right side of the sleeve facing the right side of the jacket. You can add a gathering line of stitches to the head of your sleeve. This will make easing the sleeve into the armhole simpler. But I just added tiny gathers by hand into the sleeve as I pinned it in place. Here you can see my sleeve head pinned into that armhole of my bodice. Next, I'm going to take it to the machine and stitch that sleeve in place. As I sew my sleeve into the armhole of my jacket, I'm going to take care around those curved edges. And I am being quite naughty here, sewing over my pins, but after stitching the sleeve into the armhole, I trim the seam allowance and finish with a zigzag stitch. And here is how the sleeve looks set into the jacket armhole. Next, I'm going to match my jacket front to my jacket back along the side edges. I will also match the side edges of my sleeve together and pin it all together to secure. It will be like pinning one long straight line, starting at the sleeve bottom edge and going down to the bottom edge of the jacket. And when pinning, take care to make sure all of your seams and edges are lined up, especially the sleeve's finished edge and the armpit seam. Next, you can sew the side seam of your sleeve and jacket together, stitching down the length of it. Again, I'm stitching here with 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance. And then I trim the excess seam allowance with pinking shears and add a zigzag stitch. And here is the jacket so far. It's looking really good, but I still want to finish the neckline, front edges, and bottom edges with bias tape for a tidy finish. On the right side of my jacket, I'm going to stitch my bias tape. I started at the bottom corner and worked around the entire edge of the jacket. I opened up one folded side of my bias tape and stitched in the folded crease. At the corners of my jacket, I carefully arranged the bias tape, creating a fold, and then put the needle down into my fabric and pivoted. This makes going around the edges easier. After I stitched the bias tape around the entire edge of my jacket, I then folded the bias tape towards the inside of the jacket, pressed it, and then stitched it down in place. I stitched on the other folded side of the bias tape, stitching it to the inside of the jacket. Again, as I stitched the bias tape to the inside of my jacket, I took care around the corners, creating a tuck if needed, and placing my needle down and pivoting as needed on those sharp corners. I also worked slowly around the curved neckline, making sure there was no puckering. If needed, you can always trim the seam allowance or clip the fabric, not the bias tape, to make turning the bias tape inwards easier. This may help ease the bias tape around those curved edges. And here you can see how the edges of my jacket look with the bias tape finishing. I think it looks tidy and matches my sleeve's edge. Also, if you wanted, you could add a hook and eye to the jacket. But I was pretty happy with the jacket, and I think it looks cute with the dress. I also love the peak of bright pink you sometimes get from the jacket's pink backing. And now for the last dress. Let's make Barbie's pink gingham dress. Now this dress is fairly simple. It requires only 3 pattern pieces: the bodice back, the bodice front, and skirt. And when cutting my pattern pieces out, I decided to cut a second layer for my bodice pieces. The gingham fabric is very lightweight and even a little bit sheer, so I wanted to double it up for the bodice so that the bodice would be a little thicker and it would have a little more structure to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is stack my 2 bodice fronts together and pin them together so that I can now treat it as one layer. This would be a great point to baste the 2 layers together to secure them. Next, I used my pattern to draw the darts into my bodice, making sure to draw the darts on the wrong side. I have used pen, but I recommend you use chalk. I also took a quick moment to pin my darts in place, pinning the apex and the legs to secure them. And then I repeated this for my bodice back pieces. Again, just layering the 2 layers together, pinning the 2 layers so I can treat them now as one layer, and then drawing in the darts, and adding a few final pins to secure the dart placement. Next, I'm going to fold my darts in half down their center and match the dart legs to one another and pin the darts in place. After pinning my dart, I am going to use my needle and thread and baste the dart in by hand. Hand basting the dart isn't 100% necessary, but because my bodice is 2 layers, I want to be completely certain that my dart is in the correct place before machine stitching it. Hand basting the dart is a great way to get the dart lined up and set before going to the machine. This can also help prevent any shifting or misaligning when sewing the dart at the machine. If your dress bodice is only 1 layer, then hand basting the dart maybe isn't necessary. And yeah, I repeat all of these steps, getting my bodice front and bodice back pieces ready and basting the darts in place so that they're ready to be taken to the machine and the darts then stitched in place with the machine. Once I've basted all of my darts in by hand, I then go to the machine and stitch them in place. And for sewing the dart, I like to start at the bottom of the dart and sew upwards, slowly tapering off the bodice as I sew. You can then tie the ends of the dart threads by hand and then press the darts with an iron and use a tailor's ham. And I'm going to repeat this for all of the darts, for both my bodice front and bodice back pieces. Next, I match my bodice front to my bodice back at the shoulders with right sides facing one another, and I pin the shoulder edges together. As a note, this is where having previously basted my layers together would have been very handy, but alas, I have not, so I'm just being very cautious about all of my pins and again still treating the 2 layers as one. I then stitch the shoulder edges of my bodice front to my bodice back together and trim the seam allowance with pinking shears. And then I add a zigzag stitch to polish off the shoulder seam, and then I press it towards the back of my bodice and top stitch it down. And now I go ahead and finally baste both of my layers together, stitching around all of the edges with a long length stitch. After basting my layers together, I tidy up the edges with a quick trim, and now I'm going to finish my neckline and armholes with bias tape. For finishing my armholes and neckline, I'm going to be using a pretty narrow bias tape. It is double fold and about 1/4 inch wide. And this time, instead of folding the bias tape all the way to the inside of my bodice, I'm going to be using it as binding. That way it's visible when worn. I think the white edges add a cute, contrasting detail to the dress. So I open up my bias tape and sew one creased edge on the wrong side of my bodice. As you can see, I have sewn right in that folded crease. Next, I'm going to fold the bias tape towards the right side of my bodice. I will want this to slightly cover my previous line of stitching, and then I can top stitch it down in place. This will create a finished edge with the bias tape as binding. I went around my entire neckline and armholes adding the bias tape, first stitching it to the wrong side and then folding it over to the right side and top stitching it down. Now there are alternative ways you can finish your armholes and neckline with the bias tape, or you could opt to finish your neckline and armholes with an entirely different method like lining. But next I'm going to sew the sides of my bodice together. And with right sides together, I will match my bodice front to my bodice back at the side edges and pin them together. Then I stitch, trim with pinking shears, and add a zigzag stitch. And now my bodice is ready for the skirt to be attached. Now, as I mentioned before, I have cut 5 skirt pieces instead of 3. I cut 2 additional skirt pieces because I want the skirt of this dress to be much fuller, and I want the extra room so I can create pleats around the waist, which will look closer to Barbie's dress from the movie. First, I will join my 5 skirt pieces together at their side edges, matching the right sides together, pinning, and then stitching. Then I will finish this seam by trimming with pinking shears and then adding a zigzag stitch. Once all 4 side seams have been sewn, I can now pin my skirt to my bodice. I will start by finding my skirt's center front point and my bodice's center front point, and then I'm going to match these 2 center front points together and pin with right sides touching. And then working out from this center front point, I'm going to create several large box pleats. I also matched the center back points of my skirt's waist edge to my bodice's waist edge and pin. I work from the center back towards my front, also creating box pleats. I kind of work from both directions, the center front and the center back, creating these pleats. And as I make these pleats, I do my best to keep the pleats symmetrical and even. I am doing some actual measuring, but I'm also doing a little more eyeball measuring to get all of my pleats set in place. I believe that there's about 6 box pleats in total. Again, making the pleats was a little time consuming. Gathering would have been quicker and easier as an alternative, but I'm very happy with how the pleats turned out. But as an alternative to pleats, you could just gather down your skirt to fit the bodice. You could use 3 skirt pieces like my previous dresses, or you could use 5 skirt pieces for a little more fullness and volume. This is totally up to you. I do think gathering is a little quicker, a little easier, but the pleats definitely give it a very different look. So if you're up for the challenge, maybe you would like to try creating pleats. Once all of my pleats have been pinned to my bodice's waist edge and I'm happy with how they're looking and how they're positioned, I go to my machine and stitch the pleats in place, stitching them to my bodice's waist edge. And as I sew over top my pleats, I take care to not bump them since the positioning of the pleats is very important. Next, I trim that waist seam with my pinking shears and then polish it off with a zigzag stitch. And now the skirt has been added to my bodice, and the next thing I'm going to do is add a zipper to the center back of my dress. First, I'm going to match the center back edges of my dress together with right sides touching. I will take care to match the neckline and waist seam as I pin the center back edges together. I am also going to indicate where I want my zipper to end. I used an additional pin, but you could use chalk or disappearing ink. Now what I'm going to do is stitch the center back edges of my dress together. Starting at the neckline, I'm going to stitch down to where I want my zipper to end with a basting stitch. Then I'm going to change to a regular length stitch and sew from where I want my zipper to end to the bottom of my dress. And then I'm going to press the center back seam open. It is in this center back seam that I'm going to add my zipper. I'm going to nestle the zipper right into the seam with the teeth facing the dress, and then I'm going to pin it in place. After pinning my zipper, I like to baste it by hand. I like to baste it by hand first to prevent being poked by pins when machine stitching the zipper. And the basting will keep the zipper in place when working on it, but of course, hand basting is totally optional. After basting the zipper in the back of my dress, I'm going to take my seam ripper and open up that back seam in my dress. This will reveal the zipper. I think it makes it easier to sew the zipper by the machine this way. Then I sew the zipper into the back of my dress using my sewing machine and going down either side of the zipper. Then, using my seam ripper, I'm going to remove any remaining basting stitches from the back of my dress. And now all that's left to do is finish the bottom edge of my dress. I have chosen to add a simple rolled hem. I folded up the bottom edge of my dress 2 times and then stitched it down in place. Then I pressed it with an iron. However, you could choose a different hem method for finishing your dress. After adding the hem, I decided I wanted to make a little belt like Barbie's. So I used some scrap gingham fabric and cut a rectangle about 6 inches wide and a few inches longer than my waist. After sewing it, I hand stitched on some snaps for closures and added pearls with some glue. And all in all, I was very happy with how it came together. Again, I think the white bias tape as binding made for a cute little detail, and I'm very happy that I added the belt. While not a perfect match to Barbie's, I think this dress has a lot of the charm and the same essence as Barbie's gingham dress, and I'm just very happy with it. And that completes my 3 Barbie looks: Weird Doll, Sad Doll, and Gingham Doll. And now I'm very excited to show you how they all look when worn. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this video and would like to see other fun DIY videos, then definitely like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.